Hello, welcome to Isaac's Book Reviews, Episode 4, and today's book is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. The Things They Carried can best be described, I think, as just a collection of stories from the Vietnam War from Tim O'Brien, who served in the war. And I think wars are a pretty sensitive subject that a lot of different authors have different ways of portraying. If you're Kurt Vonnegut, the best way to cope with the grim realities of war is simply to satirize them. Now, it's not that Vonnegut thinks that war isn't a serious subject matter, but he really finds a way to find humor even in the darkest of situations, and it brings some levity to the grim subject of World War II in Slaughterhouse-Five. In All Quiet on the Western Front, Eric Maria Remarque presents the realities of World War I in a very grim and unflinching way with no hope or optimism, because really, in his time in World War I, that's not what he experienced, and the book has no happy ending, just like World War I had no happy ending, so this doesn't involve any levity like Slaughterhouse-Five does. So I'm just trying to present some strategies for telling about war, and before I get into the things they carried, just to present some other authors' ideas of war, just as a broad generalization. For the things they carried, instead of just focusing on one writing style or tone, I think the author really gives his experience a voice all of its own. Instead of focusing on one perspective or just one style of writing, the author covers many different subject matters with different methods that suit the subject matter very well, I think. So some stories are longer and some stories are shorter. Some are almost like short, almost poetic reflections on his time in the war. And some of the stories are much longer, and some of the stories don't offer such an easy explanation of morality. Some have very clear lessons on what the soldiers did right and wrong, and some leave the decision of morality up to the reader. And it's this intertwining of different types of writing, different types of stories. It's not just focused on one. Some sections of the book will be short reflections that he has on even some of the stories. He'll just write what he thought about the last story, or it could be 20 or 30 pages on a grim war story. It creates this quality almost like the author is speaking to you. It reads sort of like a collection of thoughts and ideas that each have their own theme, and at the same time it combines a larger theme, but each individual little tale, it's almost just like you're sitting across from a veteran and he's telling you his thoughts in sometimes a clear and concise way, and sometimes a longer and more complicated way. And the first story in the book, I'm not going to have time to go over every single story, but what I want to point out is that what each quality that Tim O'Brien does that makes the writing in the book good, and I want to go over each story. I'm going to point out a quality in that story that I think is worth mentioning, and also while explaining the story. So the first story is called The Things They Carried. It's the titular story, and it's about Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, the commander of Alpha Company. In this story, The Things They Carried, the first thing it does is introduce all the characters in the book, some who were real people and some who have pseudonyms and either were inspired by other characters, and it sort of sets the stage for the characters that are involved in most of the stories. And it focuses on the first story. It focuses on Jimmy Cross and the burden that he bears is leadership, and he's distracted by the life he left behind back in the U.S., specifically unrequited love for a girl named Martha, who he writes letters to and receives back cryptic messages that don't profess the love from Martha that he feels for her. He feels that his attention should be fully on protecting his men, but he is constantly distracted by his love, Martha. This is what he says. He says, quote, "The letters weighed 4 ounces. They were signed Love, Martha, but Lieutenant Cross understood that love was only a way of signing and did not mean what he sometimes pretended it meant." And later he goes on to say, "He had difficulty keeping his attention on the war. On occasion, he would yell at his men to spread out on the column, to keep their eyes open, but then he would slip away into daydreams. And he goes on to talk about Martha a little bit, but I'm not going to quote everything he says, but that's the basic idea. Eventually, one of Cross's men gets shot in the head while he's away from the rest of the group, and this causes Cross to blame himself and blame the distraction of Martha for the soldier's death, even though accidents happen and it probably wasn't his fault entirely. And the story ends with Cross burning Martha's pictures sort of in the rain. He's struggling with it, and he's been struggling with the weight of his love for Martha and his duty to the war. And another thing this story does throughout is it illustrates the physical weight of each item. Like, it'll tell how many pounds and ounces a particular item weighs that the soldiers have to carry in order to demonstrate that the hardest burdens to carry really can't be measured. Yes, the emotional toll of the war weighs the most heavy, and Cross's burden of Martha is focused on most in this story, but Tim O'Brien uses in this story the weight of each physical item in order to illustrate what can't be weighed as opposed to what can, and that what can't be is significantly harder to bear. Another thing that Tim O'Brien does is he'll tell a specific story, but he'll tell it multiple times, but he'll add in new details each time he tells it. And I think our minds tend to forget things we read, even if the writing is good. And I think the author really sort of picks up on this and has a surprisingly simple but effective way to make thoughts stick to the reader. And instead of telling a story from beginning to end once, he'll tell a small section of a story or a visual from it, and then he'll ride away from it and write something else, and holding the suspense as the reader waits for new details, almost like a news story about what's going to happen next. And sometimes he'll tell the same details over and over again, with sometimes even some of the same words, but he'll add new layers of interpretation or thoughts. So this is from one of the stories called How to Tell a True War Story. This is a good example of the writing technique and practice. So this is the first time he writes about the event, or one of the first times. He says, "When he died, it was almost beautiful, the way the sunlight came around him and lifted him up and sucked him high into a tree full of moss and vines and white blossoms." For context, this is why he was lifted into the tree was a landmine that blew him up and lifted him into a tree. And then he adds this passage later with the new details that I discussed. He says, "The parts were just hanging there, so Dave Jensen and I were ordered to shinny up and peel them off. I remember the white bone of an arm. I remember pieces of skin and something wet and yellow that must have been the intestines." And then he finishes the chapter with this quote. He says, "He laughed and took that curious half step from shade into sunlight, his face suddenly brown and shining, and when his foot touched down, in that instant, he must have thought it was the sunlight that was killing him. It was not the sunlight. It was a rigged 4 or 5 round." And this type of repetition can be found in most, or not most, but a good many of the stories, especially the ones that deal with combat and death. And it's very effective, as you can tell, because you've heard essentially the same story that I've been telling you, but with new layers of detail and nuance each time to really help you remember it. Another thing the author does really well in the story is the way he writes internal conflict. And as someone who's tried to write stories with internal monologues and arguments, it's not easy in the slightest. If you overdo it, it's pretentious. If you don't flesh it out enough, it's too vague. But I think the author does it really masterfully. It feels authentic and real every single time, just the way that people argue with themselves. And in one of the stories called On the Rainy River, the author describes how he was drafted for the war and how he almost ran away to Canada to avoid his military service. And at the last moment, he decides against it, and he's fighting on himself up until the very end decision. And the writing is very reminiscent of how myself and people actually seem to make life-changing decisions. And I'll just let this passage speak for itself. It says, "I couldn't endure the mockery or the disgrace or the patriotic ridicule. Even in my imagination, the shore just 20 yards away, he's crossing the river into Canada, or he's thinking about it. I couldn't make myself be brave. It had nothing to do with morality. Embarrassment, that's all it was. And right then I submitted. I would go to the war. I would kill and maybe die because I was embarrassed not to. And I think it strikes the perfect balance between understandability and simplicity. It's simple and it's understandable and it's not too pretentious, but you really feel as if you're inside his head and listening to him argue with himself between a very life-changing decision. And another thing the author does, another strategy the author has, is blurring the line between fact and fiction. It's sort of a theory that underlies a lot of the novel. And the author did serve in the Vietnam War, and most of the characters are either real or inspired by real people, but the author never makes it exactly clear what is fact and what is fiction or what's just exaggerated truth. It's explained in the book that most of the time soldiers in Vietnam were under so much stress and so terrified that anything they perceive as truth could never be fully accurate. And so their visions of the war, what really happened, are so distorted that they're not even in the right headspace to differentiate between what is truth and what is fiction. So how real are the events of the novel? Even though he was there to witness it, the author's guess is just as good as yours. Those are some of the inventive and very creative strategies that the author uses to make the story engaging and makes it not just one of my favorite war novels, but one of my favorite novels in general. But just conclude, I want to just discuss a few more of the stories that really stuck with me and maybe a few more ideas. I'm going to move away from the strategies a little bit and just move to summarize a few more stories just that left an impact on me. So after the war was over, the author got a request from one of the men he served with. Since his friend knew he was a writer, he requested that he write a story about a veteran driving around and around with no sense of purpose, because that's how his friend felt, and he wanted it in words. And so this sense of not having a purpose after the war is pretty prevalent in war, the way people portray war, and especially Vietnam after people get home. And so this is what O'Brien wrote. No, excuse me. This is what the letter, the request to write the story. This is what his friend wrote, and to inspire the story for the author to write. He says, "The thing is, there's no place to go, not just in this lousy little town in general. My life, I mean, it's almost like I got killed over in Nam." So that's how O'Brien's friend felt, and this inspired this story of a veteran just driving endlessly around and around a lake with no sense of purpose. And it's one of the slower stories, but it really does strike a chord and make you think about how you can die in a war and part of you still come back, but there's part of you that was left over there that no one can see, that's missing. So that story I thought it's maybe not one of the most exciting stories, but it definitely left an impact and will make you think about veterans after they come back from wars. I think my favorite story from this book is a story called The Sweetheart of the Song Trabong, which the Song Trabong is just a river. And this is, admittedly, the author admits or implies that this story was almost completely fabricated, is just a war legend. But I've been thinking about it ever since I read it. It's pretty haunting, and I won't tell you really that much about it just because I haven't even really been able to condense it into the way I feel myself. So I'll just give you a synopsis, and it'd probably be best if you just read it, because it's difficult to really explain just the impact it has. It's essentially one of the soldiers arranges for his girlfriend to be flown in on a supply chopper, which already that's very far-fetched and probably never happened, but they flew her in on a supply chopper to live with him in Vietnam at the barracks or whatever, when they weren't out serving in the field. They were, I think it was a medical base, I can't exactly remember, but she starts instead of being normal, and she starts going out on missions with the Green Berets and starts disappearing for days on end, and she starts to have this horrifying transformation into a soldier. It's just very, very disturbing in a way that it's hard for me to describe. So I think if you don't read the entire book, I think I would read that specific story and how to tell a true war story, as I mentioned earlier, as well as I think the last story is very good and very touching, as I won't go into it here, but the last story is very good as well. So just those few stories, I think if don't have time to read the whole novel, I think if you read those, it'd give you a very good idea of some of the tall tales, some of the realities. So if you don't have time to read, just pick out those, and those are good stories to read. Overall, this is a phenomenal book with really no flaws that I can find, which is pretty rare. Usually there's something anybody can nitpick, but I mean, if you have anything to nitpick in the comments, if you've read it, then go ahead. But as for me, I can't find anything significant enough to nitpick it at all. So I give it 5 stars, and I'll give it the Isaac Book Seal of Approval, which, of course, is the highest honor that a book can achieve. So I do have to do more of these videos soon, so stay tuned for more, and hopefully I'll make some more if I have time. So thanks for watching Isaac's Book Reviews, Episode 4.